Today we're connecting all evidence in My Hero Academia that heavily indicates Deku will get All for One. This video will also elaborate on the final fate of Shigaraki at the end of the series, which has been hinted at by Horikoshi during a few interviews. I'm so confident in the core of this theory that right now I'm making a Turtle Quirk guarantee that by the end of this video you'll agree with me that Midoriya will get All for One. Just before we get into it, there will be spoilers ahead for those of you who don't read the manga, so proceed with caution if you don't want to know anything that happens after season 4. Also, today's video is sponsored by our friends at Crunchyroll, who are offering a 14-day free trial of their premium membership if you go to crunchyroll.com/turtlequirk. With Attack on Titan starting again pretty soon, and Jujutsu Kaisen currently airing, it has never been a better time to get Crunchyroll Premium. The episodes arrive on the site literally 1 hour after airing in Japan, and they're professionally subtitled, not to mention accessible on all smart devices. These past few months, I've personally been using Crunchyroll on my PS4, and I've caught up on a ton of series, including parts 1 to 5 of JoJo's, season 1 of Mob Psycho 100, and I'm currently checking out JJK every Friday. Many of you already know I used it to catch up on Black Clover earlier this year, which is now one of my favorite series, so definitely give Crunchyroll a try if you're looking for more anime to explore. There are 3 different premium tiers you can choose from, and your free trial will be valid for any of them, meaning you can pick the ultimate fan tier and, get unlimited downloads of any anime you want. Like I said, you can access everything I've mentioned and more by going to crunchyroll.com/turtlequirk and getting your 2-week free trial. Now, to kick off this theory, let's start with how Deku is going to get All for One, and to do that I'm going to explain some important context that you need to listen to even if you're fully caught up with the manga. In chapter 287, AFO revealed a crucial piece of information about quirks, which is that every quirk in this series contains a copy of its user's consciousness. One for All has the quirks of its previous users stored inside it, and their consciousness manifests as the famous vestiges. Like AFO, Deku can visit his vestige world if he's asleep or in some kind of temporary trance, and he's able to use their quirks when he's awake. Granted, he's only used Black Whip and Float as of making this video, but the point I'm making is that, by the end of the series, Deku will use all the quirks inside One for All. Now, ask yourself exactly how One for All is storing these quirks of the previous users. We know that with All for One, he can straight up steal people's quirks by using the hole in his hand. He was just born that way and it's never changed. One for All is not a naturally occurring quirk, so what aspect of it enables this quirk storage? In case you may have forgotten, One for All is the combination of 2 totally different powers, and it's crucial that we look at them separately to understand how Deku will get All for One. The first power belonged to AFO's brother, and it was a pretty pointless ability that I'm sure you're aware of. The quirk could be transferred to someone else if he wanted the transfer to happen, and if someone consumed a piece of his DNA. That was it, it was just a quirk that could be transferred. In the present day, that means 3 things for One for All. Number 1, One for All can be transferred, as we know. Number 2, the user has to want the transfer to happen. And number 3, it means that someone has to consume the user's DNA to receive One for All. We can clearly see how the transfer quirk affects One for All. However, obviously One for All has way more abilities than just what I've mentioned. It has the vestiges, it has the quirks of the previous users, and it has the immense power that has built up over the generations. Those abilities are not the result of the transfer quirk, as we can see, but rather the power stalker quirk that All for One gave to his brother. It was previously believed that the power stalker was only good for building up physical strength. After all, All Might went his entire hero career only using the strength of One for All. He never manifested any additional quirks like Black Whip, for example. It was only in chapter 213 that we began to understand that the power stalker did more than just store up physical strength. Instead, it would also store up the quirk factor of the quirks that it came into contact with, which is why the quirk of each user is inside One for All. With that context out of the way, let's get into how Midoriya will get All for One, and then I'll explain the fate of Shigaraki. To begin, AFO himself held the Power Stalker quirk for an unknown period of time, before transferring it to his brother. I'll repeat that. AFO had the Power Stalker quirk in his body before his brother, before Nana Shimura, and obviously before Midoriya. He was the first person to have it besides the original user. From everything we've already established, the Power Stalker absorbs the quirk of anyone it's transferred to, and the first person it was ever transferred to was AFO. Whilst he was never a user of One For All, he had the part of One For All that stores the quirk of, the people who have it. What the Power Stalker does is duplicate the quirks that it comes into contact with, leaving them totally unaware that their quirk has been copied. And this is actually supported by something All Might said in chapter 217, as well as the fact that quirk duplication is a very common thing in this universe. If you're a manga reader, you've seen it a million times by this point. In All Might's opinion, his master, Nana Shimura, didn't know One For All contained the quirks of previous users. If that belief is accurate, then it confirms the Power Stalker duplicates quirks rather than steals quirks, and here's why. Nana Shimura gave One For All to All Might when he was in middle school. If One For All had stolen her quirk from her, then Float would have disappeared alongside One For All. Sure, she would have had the embers of One For All for a while, just like All Might did, but the flame dies out eventually, and it certainly would not have lasted the 4 years between this moment when she gave it to him and her death. What I'm saying is that when the flames of One For All died out, she still retained her original Float quirk, just like AFO retained his original All For One quirk. All Might's statement confirms this because Nana Shimura didn't even know that her own quirk was stored inside One For All. Clearly, if it took her quirk, then she'd obviously be aware of that because she wouldn't have it anymore. The fact she wasn't aware that quirks were being stored indicates that there's a duplicate version of her Float quirk rather than the original. Therefore, bringing it back to AFO now, his All For One quirk must have been copied by the Power Stalker, just like everyone else who has had this power in their body. Once you have it, it copies your quirk. That's the way it's operated for all the users of One For All, and that's how it would have operated for All For One as well. He then gave the Power Stalker to his brother, completely unaware, and of course this created One For All, which means at the very core of One For All, seemingly unknown to everybody, is All For One. It exists in the core of One For All. This has been foreshadowed several times when looking back. For example, Bakugo referred to Deku as being the same as All For One, and then on the next page we got this panel, which literally speaks for itself. Just look at what Deku says here. This point was again foreshadowed later in chapter 285, when All Might discovers something about One For All that he doesn't want to speculate, which is then followed by a flashback of Bakugo saying that One For All is the same as All For One. Additionally, we've had two big moments that show a psychic connection between Deku and All For One. The first was during the joint training arc, and basically Deku was super hyped to start his match against Class 1B, and this was then followed by All For One in prison, who claimed that he could now hear his little brother's voice. The very next chapter, Deku activated Black Whip for the first time, and that is obviously not a coincidence. Midoriya unlocked the first of his new quirks the chapter immediately after AFO just randomly hears his brother's voice. Clearly, there is some sort of connection, something weird going on there. The second psychic moment happened during the war arc, in which as soon as Shigaraki received the All For One quirk, the vestige of the first user appeared to Deku and just told Midoriya to stop Shigaraki. How did he even know that Shigaraki had awoken at that moment? The answer is that the core of One For All already contained All For One, which explains the psychic connection. He was aware of Shigaraki getting the All For One quirk. Moving on though, remember how the fifth user said that all the quirks inside One For All have been building up alongside the quirk itself? Well, All For One was the first quirk to be inside One For All, technically speaking, which means it's been growing in power ever since the beginning. This provides the ultimate setup for the endgame for Deku to unlock All For One, but like a supercharged version of the quirk that we've never seen before, and hopefully overpower Shigaraki in the process. But just before we get into Shigaraki's fate, we need to talk about the two missing vestiges of One For All. There is at least one vestige for all of the previous users of One For All. What there isn't though is a vestige for All For One himself, and there's no vestige for the original user for the Power Stalker quirk. I don't think that they're the two vestiges that are currently shadows, and I have a few reasons for thinking this. Number one is that they were never holders of One For All, So if that's them there, then the order is just totally messed up. For example, All Might would really be the 6th user of One For All rather than the 8th, despite having the kanji for 8 in his name. And similarly, Deku would be the 7th user despite having the kanji for 9 in his name. I don't think Horikoshi would fumble like this and mess up the orders of the One For All users, so I don't think that these two characters here are All For One and the Power Stalker Quirk person. Instead, I think it's safe to assume that these two vestiges are hidden inside the core of One For All after the Power Stalker merged with the Transfer Quirk. The 5th user did say that Deku would be the one to complete One For All. At face value, that means that he's gonna unlock all the quirks of the previous users, but once he's completed One For All, that is probably when it would be appropriate for the All For One reveal to happen and to, get the look inside the core of One For All, and we see AFO and the Power Stalker vestige. It's possible that Deku and the other vestiges will have to defeat All For One inside the vestige world, and if they win that battle, then Deku gains control over his quirk. Let me know your thoughts on that theory, and also where you think the AFO vestige is. Do you think it just disappeared after the Power Stalker merged with the Transfer Quirk? Or do you think, like I do, that All For One's vestige is literally inside the core of One For All, and so it's kind of hidden away? Turning our attention to Shigaraki now, in an interview with Toho Cinema magazine in 2018, Horikoshi hinted at something of interest. The interviewer asked him if Shigaraki was a villain that should be saved, and Hori replied by saying, "Yes, I think so. I think we've gotten to the point where Shigaraki can no longer turn back though. If I say more, I feel like it'll dampen your imagination, so I won't explain in detail." This is Horikoshi admitting 2 years ago that he would like Shigaraki to be saved, but in his opinion, Shigaraki has just gone too far at this point. Bearing in mind what he said in this interview, it's relevant to now see that during the war arc, despite everything that's happened so far, despite everything Shigaraki has done, Deku still tried to save him from being absorbed by All For One, which in my opinion is a big indicator of how the endgame of this series is going to play out. Midoriya is incapable of intentionally killing Shigaraki. His actions in the Vestige world prove this to me beyond a reasonable doubt. At the same time, to not kill Shigaraki at the end of the series would mean that he'd always be a threat and someone who could possibly return at any time. Even if Deku was to use All For One and One For All to take Shigaraki's quirks, the fact remains that, Shiggy has a body that is so powerful, it's near All Might levels of strength, and that's even without any quirks. So if you take his quirks, he's still just as strong. The only way to truly neutralize Shigaraki without killing him is to strip him of all power, not just his quirks, but his physical enhancements as well. In a different interview, Horikoshi mentioned how the story of My Hero Academia would culminate with all characters coming together in the final arc, including one very important character that was introduced during the internship arc, which is the overhaul arc. I've said it many times that this character is obviously Eri, and what if, in some sort of attempt to help Deku, Eri rewind Shigaraki back into Tenko Shimura? Horikoshi said that Tomura Shigaraki had reached a point of no return, but as we should all know by now, Tomura and Tenko could not be more different in their ideologies. When I looked into the meaning of Tenko's name, the first part means to change, and the last part meant arc. Him changing back into Tenko during the final arc loosely fits the meaning of the name Tenko. If Eri was to rewind him, then the threat of Shigaraki would disappear because his bodily enhancements would all go, and Tenko would have the chance to get a do-over in life without the influence of AFO. Naturally, this theory only works if Shigaraki's memories are also rewound, and you know what? The only person we've ever seen Eri rewind this far back was her dad, and he ceased to exist. So perhaps when she does these big rewinds, people's memories are also rewound with it. We just don't know because there's no living character who has suffered that big of a rewind before. Horikoshi has confirmed Eri's importance for the final arc, and we also know that Deku lacks the intent to kill Shigaraki. We also know that Deku wants to save everyone, and by turning Shigaraki back into Tenko, you've saved someone who had a pretty terrible life, all because of this evil guy who was obsessed with his grandma and obsessed with his family and tracked him down and raised him to be a villain. And at the same time, it wasn't just All For One who failed Shigaraki. he was walking along the streets and not a single person or a single hero came to actually help him. So he's been failed on all counts. So to get this chance to have a do-over in life, start from ground zero, it's a nice way to avoid Deku killing someone that he pretty much has to kill to resolve everything. And yeah, you know, it's within Eri's powers. She's done this before. She's rewound someone this far back before. So listen, it's possible. That was my theory on how Deku will get All for One and how the endgame of My Hero Academia might play out. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this, and until the next one, peace out.